pleasure and honor to have with us today Mr. Vladimir Bukovsky, a famous Russian human rights activist, an author, and a political activist. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Bukovsky, can you tell us a little bit about your very personal journey to the Gulag?
Well, that was very long ago. I must have been 16 when I found myself in a complete disagreement with the Soviet system, and I knew I would not live with it. It wouldn't work. So I started behaving accordingly. The first time I was arrested, I was 18-year-old, and the official charge was a possession of a forbidden book. But of course, there was something behind it which they didn't want to write down. But official charge was that. And for that, I was sent to lunatic asylum, for psychiatric hospital for treatment, for almost 2 years. Then I was released and again organized the demonstrations in defense of some arrested writers. And off and on, it went on like that till 1971, when I was finally arrested last time for getting together and smuggling abroad the documents proving the Soviet use of psychiatry for repressive purposes. And for that I was given a 12-year sentence, which I didn't finish. I was exchanged for a Chilean communist in the middle of my term. So all in all, together I've spent something like 12 years in different institutions, and 6 more I should have served, but I didn't.
Mr. Bukovsky, you are one of the featured discussants in the film The Soviet Story, which has been put together by a Latvian director, Devin Snor. How did you get involved with this particular documentary, and what did you hope to achieve with this film?
Well, I wasn't the author of this film, I was just a participant in it, and I do participate in a large number of documentaries or interviews or whatever, simply because I'm an expert on certain parts of history and political analysis. I would imagine the creators of the film had a very particular purpose in their mind. At that time, there was a discussion in Europe of the necessity for a resolution condemning Soviet system, condemning communism as a crime against humanity. And there was quite a big number of votes in the Council of Europe, or even in the European Parliament, of people who would support this kind of resolution. And in order to explain why we need it and what it was really, because younger generations don't necessarily remember what it was, the Latvian producer decided to make a documentary. I've learned about it only when he invited me to participate. I didn't know about the things behind it. It was finally produced and was screened in Europe, was shown in the European Parliament, was debated about, was shown in Baltic countries, was prohibited to be shown in Russia. So they never showed it in Russia. But it was shown in many countries. The resolution, unfortunately, at the last moment was watered down under the pressure from Russia. So they condemned totalitarian regimes in Europe, but they never mentioned Soviet Union by name. So that was kind of a compromise. So that's the history of the film, as far as I know.
What do you see in terms of this effort for the future to recognize the crimes of communism?
Well, I think it's one of the very important causes to pursue, because so many problems of today's Eastern Europe, or Russia in particular, stems out of that lack of knowledge of their own history and lack of understanding how much the societies were mutilated by these decades of communist rule. And without cleaning up that past of all the fabrications and mythology created by the Soviet propaganda, you have to engage in this kind of projects to remind the history as it was, to show, to disclose the falsifications, and for people to know what had happened. The importance of it is difficult to overestimate. For example, in Russia today, the lack of understanding how much the country actually was involved in crimes, and how the regime would force practically the whole society to be accomplices in these crimes. That lack of understanding prevents today's people, the people living today in Russia, from realizing the need for them to come clean of it, to renew their life, to start building their society from the scratch. They mostly would blame anyone for collapse of Soviet Union, and they wouldn't even think how much they contributed to it. And therefore nothing happens. There is no revival in the country. And lots of similar reasons are in Eastern Europe, where the establishment is still very heavily penetrated by former nomenclatura, people who were occupying positions of power in the communist time, and therefore very much corrupted by it, and very often work together as some kind of mafia, preventing any democratic changes and blocking them. So it's a very significant obstacle, and the lack of clarity about the past makes it more and more difficult.
Mr. Bukovsky, why do you think there is this reluctance to deal with this part of history by the West, I guess, in general? Because we are talking mostly about history.
Well, the same reasons could be mentioned as the ones which prevent the people inside of these countries to come clean of their own history. It's, first of all, it's a personal involvement, and how much actually was contributed by people to the horrors of that regime. And the same with the West. I mean, how much West actually contributed to that by collaborating with the Soviet regime for one or another reason. And the West doesn't want to admit that or even to think about it. And we know that that was probably one of the reasons why Soviet regime could exist for so long. If the West would take a very critical, confrontational state, like Ronald Reagan did in the beginning of the 80s, the regime could have been finished years before. And for them it's painful, that's their mistakes, sometimes not entirely selfless mistakes. In my knowledge, the establishment in the West was pretty much involved not only in political circles, but also business circles, cultural figures. They were all involved with Moscow one way or another. And of course for them now to admit that they contributed to these crimes against humanity is a pretty unpleasant position to take.
Mr. Bukovsky, when you were the 12 years you spent in the Gulag, you had many, I guess, cellmates, and some of them being, I guess, the Ukrainians.
Sure.
And so can you tell us a little bit about your relations with the Ukrainians?
Oh, I had very good relations with Ukrainians. I was with Lev Kolukyanenko. We spent almost 2 years in the same cell in Vladimir prison. I knew quite a number of them: Svetlichny, Antonyuk, Horbal, well, a very long list, Pranyuk, Kalinets. I don't know what he's doing now. I haven't seen him for ages. It was at that time, among Ukrainians, it was I guess the cream of Ukrainian literature. It was the best writers at that time. They all were in jail, and we had a privilege of sharing these facilities with them. So my relations were always quite good. We discussed the future a lot, and a lot of problems which now confront, for example, Ukraine, were discussed by us in prisons and labor camps. So they are not anticipated, in a sense.
Now, I understand you went to Ukraine and spoke to the Rada
1991, in September 1991, shortly before George Bush came and tried to persuade Ukraine not to separate, I actually did the opposite. I came and addressed Rada and explained to them that as a Russian, I don't see any particular problem in Ukraine separating. I mean, it's only going to be good for both of us. Have more responsibility for your own affairs, and and more resources for your own things is only better for everyone. And at that time, Rada, I must say, they had dozens of former political prisoners, so I could recognize faces speaking to them of my former cellmates and campmates. So that was a very hopeful moment. We all hope that Ukraine will achieve a much bigger degree of democracy than others because of that.
Mr. Bukovsky, Ukraine and Russia are neighbors and of course will always be neighbors. What do you think can be done to help improve relations between Ukraine and Russia on all levels?
Well, I mean, improving relations with your neighbor is always important to start with saying the truth to each other and establishing the historic truth and not trying to hold back what you might have done wrong. That's the first stage. I mean, if you want to be friends with your neighbor, you tell them, well, I was wrong, I tried to harm you, and them telling you, yes, we were also wrong and we tried to harm you. And once you say that, there is nothing hidden in your relations, so you can start them anew and be quite friendly. That's one thing. Second thing, it's important for both sides to understand that the better relations we have, the best it's going to be for both sides. When Ukraine became separate, independent, and they suddenly introduced customs regulations and things like that, and the Ukrainians couldn't bring their goods to Russia to sell. I thought, Jesus, we didn't mean that. That wasn't the idea for which we were in jail. And the idea was freedom of trade, freedom of movement. Yes, separate countries, separate administrations, whatever politics you might like to pursue is your business. But to put some kind of obstacles and walls between the nations is stupid. It just harms both sides. So that was kind of unexpected performance on the part of both countries. So that's another thing you have to start. You have to understand that you have to be beneficial for each other. It's not going to be me doing better at your expense. It's going to be better for both. That's the approach. And don't hide anything. Be open. Don't be afraid of saying. I mean, I remember Soviet time, and we had all kind of jokes. Russians about Georgians, Georgians about Armenians, Ukrainians about Russians, Russians about Estonians, and all of us about Jews, and Jews about us. And that was never perceived as insulting or offensive. It was fun. And actually, it helped to discharge any tension which authorities deliberately tried to build up. They quite often would stir up national difficulties, differences, in order to profit on that. The honest humor, honest jokes would always discharge this tension. And that's probably why we never start killing each other, because at the critical moment people would start to remember the jokes about each other and rather laugh than do anything stupid. So I don't see any reason why should the Russians and Ukrainians have bad relations. I mean, we have so much in common. We have such a huge number of intermarriages, a common history for hundreds of years. We have to be honest with all that, We have to admit something was wrong here and something was done wrong here, which is not painful. I mean, the more open you are, the easier it is. So I don't see any reason why it should be otherwise. As far as separation is concerned, people don't understand. Many people live by traditions of 19th centuries. They don't understand that the time of empires has passed. That empires are not to your benefit anymore. British were the first to just give it away. They just agreed voluntarily to part with the empire, and they only benefited from that. and then other nations followed. And it's not a time for empires, it's a different time. When you have the smaller unit you have, the more profitable it is. Look at Hong Kong. I mean, Hong Kong is a tiny place, but at one point it was richer than the whole huge Chinese Republic. That shows you how little meaning the space has now. The countries are not richer just because they're bigger. They're richer because they're smarter, because they develop further intensively technology and things like that. So the separation I was always perceived empire as an obstacle to our freedom as well. Because in Russian history, if you look at it, lots of unjust and horrible things were made just for the sake of keeping empire, you know. And this empire became kind of an idol to which the sacrifices were brought. Our own freedom was brought as a sacrifice to that idol. And in reality, none of us wanted it. So my attitude to empires as such was always negative, and that's why when the time came, I felt quite comfortable with the idea of Baltic countries becoming independent, Ukraine, Caucasus, Central Asia. I didn't feel any particular loss for myself on that. And so did majority of the people. I remember the reaction of Russian population to the dissolution of the Soviet Union was very mild. It was very mild and rather friendly. I mean, the Baltic countries, well, they've never been truly part of our territories. They were occupied. Ukrainians, well, Ukrainians, closest brothers we have. If they one day want to reunite, it's up to them. You know, there was never ill feelings toward that. Not in population. The political elites might say whatever they would say because of their own interests, but the population in general took it very easily, without much of ill feelings.
Mr. Bukovsky, if I might presume to call you a Russian patriot, in a sense, from your comments and also from your history, that even after you left Russia, there were several times when you were, I guess, recruited to come back, and I guess even ran for, contemplated running for the presidency. What is it that concerns you most about what's going on in Russia today?
Well, Russia did everything wrong, unfortunately. I mean, for the last 9-10 years, they're marching backwards. Instead of building democratic institutions, they're dismantling them. Instead of encouraging the freedom of press and speech, they're actually curtailing it and returning political censorship and persecutions. Instead of building up good relations with neighbors, they actually raise up tension and behave rather aggressively and trying to recreate the former sphere of influence, which is not going to be to the benefit of Russia or any neighbor. It came to a point of practically a war with Georgia, which is completely unnecessary. I mean, there is no national interest of Russia in these two small territories of Georgia. Why would anyone want to occupy them? Only to spite someone. There was no other underlying rationale behind it. Just to show these Americans that they can't do anything. We do whatever we like. It's the behavior of some bully in the street, you know, some drunken bully. It's not the behavior of responsible government or responsible country to do that. So this is all wrong. This is building, once again, undemocratic, repressive country in which no one likes to live. We now have again a huge immigration from Russia. Young, bright, and capable people are preferring to immigrate to any other country, including United States, and we all see them here, including Britain, including Germany, including any place where they can realize their talents and abilities. And in Russia, again, they can't do that. So that's a tragedy. We're just losing yet another generation instead of starting to organize our own life. So this is all stupid what they're doing, and it leads nowhere. It probably builds up ego of few KGB colonels who just happened to be on the top of the pyramid. But it's certainly not going to be good for the country. It's going to harm us again.
Well, you're a man who doesn't mince words.
No, I don't.
So any advice or words of wisdom for those of us in the West?
Well, the West doesn't understand the nature of the regime we are dealing with. They still, live on the illusion that it's a national regime. It's not national regime. It's KGB regime. What we have right now in Russia is a KGB regime, and the KGB is a very specific organization with a specific psychology, which is not necessarily national for any nation. It's rather international. These are the people who cannot be partners. They can't have an agreement with you because their idea is not to have an agreement and live in peace. Their idea is to change you, to control you. They are control freaks. They are maniacs of control. And as long as they don't control you, they perceive you as an enemy. So trying to make better relations with them by offering them some compromises is the wrong thing. It just shows them, persuades them that you are weak, that you could be pushed further and further and further, that more and more could be demanded from you. So that's what the West is doing without understanding what they are doing. It's typical appeasement. Their policy toward Putin's Russia is typical appeasement. And we all know what appeasement brought to Europe.
Mr. Bukovsky, you've been very active, and I guess you started your work in terms of publishing a unauthorized magazine when you were in school. What are your current projects or future projects that you have?
Well, I travel a lot. I write occasionally. Not that much, not as much as I used to, but I do still write occasionally. I go to Eastern Europe very often, whenever I can give them advice, particularly about the Western influence and what part of it is good for them and what part is not. I have no particular one single out project on my hands. I am engaged in campaigning against further European integration, turning Europe into a unitary state, multinational unitary state, similar to the Soviet Union structure. In that, I participate in many countries in different activities. So it's different parts of different things. Unfortunately, the world today becoming less and less free, and therefore my natural instinct is to try and to support forces who would be standing for freedom, whatever the aspect of it we are talking about.
Well, thank you very much.
Sure.
We appreciate your candor and your words of wisdom. So, again, and we hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.